Frank's pen hovered over the divorce papers like a dagger, his smirk deepening, as if he'd just won the final battle. But he had no idea the judge was about to drop a truth that would wipe that smug grin right off his face. Martha sat across the courtroom table, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of finality pressing against her chest. She had spent years bracing for this moment, yet nothing could prepare her for watching the man she once loved chuckle in open relief. Frank leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen twice before signing with theatrical flair. Finally, he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt. "Am free from your dead weight." His friends, seated a few rows behind him, snickered softly, thinking it was all just a formality, another woman discarded by a powerful man. For a brief moment, the courtroom was silent, almost frozen in awkward disbelief. Then the judge cleared his throat, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of restrained authority. "Before we proceed," he said, flipping through the papers with deliberate care, "there's one final financial detail that must be read into the record." As each word left his lips, Frank's confident smile began to falter, confusion flickering in his eyes. He leaned forward, suddenly tense, unaware that Martha wasn't leaving this marriage empty-handed. No, she was walking away with far more than he ever imagined. Martha's eyes remained locked on the polished oak table before her, but her mind drifted back through the years, replaying every choice that had led to this cold courtroom. She was only 22 when she met Frank at a community college fundraiser in Des Moines. He was brimming with ambition, his talk filled with dreams of launching a tech startup that would change the world. Martha, with her quiet grace and nurturing heart, believed in him instantly. At that time, she held her own dreams close. She had always wanted to launch a small boutique fashion brand, envisioning shelves lined with her colorful scarf designs and hand-stitched dresses inspired by her grandmother's patterns. But when Frank looked into her eyes and whispered promises of their shared future, her dreams slipped quietly to the side, making room for his. Every morning, Martha woke at dawn to work long hours as a teller at the local bank. Her feet ached from standing and her fingers cracked from winter cold, counting stacks of bills. She returned home each evening to cook Frank's favorite meal spot roast with rosemary garlic butter tilapia, fluffy biscuits. Even when they fell behind on rent, she didn't complain. Silently, she took her gold bracelet, a gift from her late mother, and pawned it to keep their lights on another month. She told herself this was love. This was partnership. In her heart, she truly believed that if Frank rose, they would rise together. That was what her mother taught her love should be: two souls lifting each other through life's storms. Martha never saw her sacrifices as weakness. She felt strong in giving. Every packed lunch she sent him off, with every gentle smile she offered. After his failures was her way of saying, "We're in this together." She imagined the day he would finally look at her and say, "We did it." But as the years passed and Frank's app became the talk of the state, everything changed. Money began to flow in like spring rain, washing away the poverty that once tethered them to reality. Reporters started calling for interviews, investors gathered around him, and he walked with a proud swagger wherever he went. Through it all, Martha kept her eyes wide open. She saw the way his friends barely acknowledged her. She noticed how he introduced her at parties, not as his wife, but as someone who helps me out at home. And every time it cut deeper than the last. Yet she held her tongue, believing her devotion would eventually reignite his love. But beneath her quiet sacrifice, something else was building, a silent ledger of every wound, every insult, every moment her loyalty was mistaken for insignificance. Martha would never forget the first time Frank truly made her feel invisible. It was at a tech conference gala in Chicago, just a year after his app launched, and his face began appearing on local news segments as the state's bright new innovator. She had spent hours preparing, ironing his navy suit, polishing his shoes until they gleamed under the chandelier light, and choosing a simple cream dress with tiny blue flowers to look presentable by his side. As they walked into the grand ballroom lined with towering glass windows reflecting the city skyline, Frank walked ahead without looking back, greeting investors with eager handshakes and dismissive nods. When someone asked who she was, he laughed lightly and replied, "Oh, that's just Martha. She helps keep the house running." Those words lodged in her chest like shards of glass. She felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as the executives turned away, uninterested, as if she were part of the catering staff weaving silently between tables. From that moment on, the man who once held her hand tenderly as they crossed icy sidewalks no longer even reached for her at all. At parties, he introduced her the same way every time, with the bland finality of a man introducing his assistant rather than his wife. Their private moments vanished too. He began sleeping on the couch after late-night meetings, scrolling endlessly through his phone, as if seeking something beyond her reach. She noticed how his laughter changed around his new circle of friends, louder, forced, concealing a simmering arrogance that wasn't there when they first met. Then came the night that broke something deep inside her. Martha was setting out a tray of snacks for Frank's poker game with his business partners. As she placed pretzels and smoked almonds on the mahogany coffee table, she heard his voice drift above the low hum of conversation. "Martha," he said with a sharp chuckle. "She was just a phase. You know how it is. A starter girl. Sweet, but you grow out of that." Laughter rippled around the room like a cruel chorus. No one looked at her face. No one saw the way her eyes watered as she bent over the table, forcing her hands to remain steady. In that moment, she felt like a ghost in her own life, serving men who didn't even register her presence as human. But if they thought she was broken, they were wrong. That night, as she lay awake, listening to the quiet hiss of the furnace, a fire ignited within her. It burned hot with betrayal, but its glow illuminated something she had forgotten long ago, who she truly was before she gave everything to Frank's dreams. The girl who stitched bright scarves by candlelight, who dreamt of having her name on a boutique sign one day, was still alive, waiting to rise from the ashes of silent sacrifice. That night, long after Frank fell asleep snoring in his leather recliner, Martha sat alone in the dim hallway, her back pressed against the cool, dry wall as she hugged her knees to her chest. His words from the poker table echoed endlessly in her mind. She was just a phase. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't what kept her awake. What kept her awake was the sudden, suffocating realization that if she didn't stand up for herself now, there would be nothing left of the woman she once was. Slowly, she rose and padded down the narrow corridor to a tiny room at the back of their house. It had once been her sanctuary, a space filled with sunlight and bright fabrics, where she used to spend quiet afternoons sketching designs for dresses, scarves, and jewelry, before life demanded she focus elsewhere. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets buried in old storage boxes. In the far corner sat her old laptop covered in a thin layer of dust. She hadn't touched it in 6 years. The sight of it nearly broke her heart with grief for the woman she had abandoned. But tonight, grief transformed into resolve. She sat at the small oak desk, wiped her trembling hands on her cotton pajama pants, and powered on the laptop. Its familiar hum filled the room like a forgotten song. As the screen flickered to life, Martha found the folder titled Dream Designs by Martha James. Her sketches appeared one by one, flowing dresses in rich jewel tones, structured jackets with delicate embroidery scarves with bold watercolor prints. Seeing them again felt like rediscovering buried treasure. Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't spill. Instead, a quiet, powerful smile curved across her lips. "This is who I am," she thought. "This is who I've always been." From that night on, Martha began living two lives. By day, she remained the quiet wife, cooking Frank's meals, folding his laundry, and listening as he boasted about his success to friends who barely acknowledged her presence. But every night after the house fell silent, she sat at her old desk for hours, sketching new designs, watching online tutorials about fashion business management, and learning everything she could about building a digital brand. Her hands moved with newfound purpose, her heart filling with a fierce determination she hadn't felt since she was a teenager dreaming of opening her own boutique. To protect herself from Frank's arrogance and suspicion, she created her business under a new name. Mary Ellen co-taught a brand that sounded upscale, timeless, and powerful. She began uploading her designs to a small online store, each listing written with care, describing the fabric's texture and the inspiration behind every piece. At first, she sold a single scarf to a teacher in Nebraska, then a wrap dress to a florist in Maine. Little by little, the orders trickled in. Customers left glowing reviews about her craftsmanship and elegant style, completely unaware that behind the brand was a woman rebuilding her life quietly under the roof of a man who thought she was nothing. Meanwhile, Frank launched a podcast about entrepreneurship. Every week he joked about wannabe female founders playing dress-up with their sewing machines. Martha listened from the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, as his words sliced through the quiet house. The pain he caused her transformed into fuel. Each time he mocked women like her, she worked harder, determined to build something that could never again be dismissed as a phase. She wasn't building Mary Ellen Company to prove him wrong. She was building it to prove to herself that her dreams had never been foolish, that she had value, that her voice still mattered. And the best part, Frank had no idea. While he sat at his mahogany desk recording his arrogant monologues, the woman he underestimated was quietly rising in power and purpose, preparing for a day when the world would know her name, and his laughter would finally fall silent. One Tuesday afternoon, as spring rain drummed softly against her kitchen window, Martha decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She packed up a homemade lunch, Frank's favorite rosemary chicken sandwich with sweet pickles on the side, and called a cab to his office building downtown. As she rode through the wet city streets, she gazed out at the passing cars and brick storefronts, a quiet ache blooming in her chest. Maybe today, she thought, maybe today hell remember 'im still here. She stepped into the sleek marble lobby, her simple beige coat dampened at the shoulders. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced at her as she asked for Frank's office suite number. Taking the elevator to the 24th floor, her heart thudded with cautious hope. She imagined setting the lunch down on his mahogany desk, imagined him looking up in surprise with softened eyes. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to picture the husband she once knew returning to her, if only for a lunch break. But when she walked into the outer office, Frank wasn't there. Instead, his young secretary sat at her glass desk, typing with nails painted a glossy crimson. Martha recognized her from the few times she'd visited before Cassidy, no older than 25, with hair the color of fresh chestnuts and a confidence that verged on arrogance. Cassidy's eyes flicked up in mild annoyance before widening with surprise, and then something darker, a smirk. "Oh," she said lightly, eyeing the lunch bag in Martha's hand. "You must be his wife." Martha nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is Frank in?" Cassidy leaned back in her chair, resting one manicured hand on her swollen belly. It took Martha a moment to process what she was seeing, the soft curve of life pressing against the secretary's tailored ivory blouse. Cassidy followed her gaze and let out a low, humorless laugh. "Oh, he didn't tell you." She tilted her head, her smirk sharpening. "He said you were his sick cousin." Wow. For a heartbeat, the entire room felt like it shifted off its axis. Martha felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stand tall, clutching the brown paper lunch bag with trembling fingers. Cassidy returned to typing, her indifference like a slap. Around them, the quiet hum of printers and clicking keyboards continued, as if nothing had happened, as if Martha's world hadn't just splintered apart. In that moment, something within her finally broke. Not her heart, he had already chipped away at that for years. No, what broke was the shell shed built to keep herself small, the shell that told her she needed his approval to feel worthy. She turned silently and walked out of the office, each step echoing across the polished floors with a quiet, gathering strength. As soon as the elevator doors closed around her, Martha pulled out her phone with steady hands. She dialed her lawyer, her voice calm and clear despite the storm raging in her chest. "It's time," she said. When she stepped back into the rain-soaked street, Martha felt no tears. She felt no pleading desperation to confront Frank or demand explanations. Instead, she felt something far more powerful, a cold, determined peace. The man who thought she would always stand silently behind him had underestimated her for the last time. She knew now that her future would no longer be shaped by his choices, his betrayals, or his belittling smirks. Her future was finally irrevocably in her own hands. The day of the divorce hearing arrived with a muted dawn, the sky heavy with dense gray clouds that seemed to mirror Martha's silent determination. She dressed simply in a charcoal gray sweater dress and modest pearl earrings, no flashy brand names, no pretension, just quiet dignity. As she entered the courthouse lobby, the scent of floor polish mingled with old paper, filling her with an unexpected calm. Today wasn't about anger or vengeance. It was about liberation. Frank sat at the polished oak table. His navy suit crisply pressed his tie, a bold burgundy. He leaned back in his chair with smug ease, flashing a toothy grin at his lawyer while drumming his manicured fingers on his phone. Occasionally he glanced at Martha, his eyes glinting with cold superiority. To him, this was a formality, a final stamp to prove he'd won. He whispered loudly to his attorney, "Just sign off quick. She's got nothing. I won't give her a dime." His lawyer chuckled softly, flipping through documents with the same detached confidence. The judge entered his presence, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. After reading the standard legal preamble, he cleared his throat and looked directly at Martha's attorney. "Is there anything your client wishes to declare before we proceed with the divorce settlement?" Frank rolled his eyes and scoffed under his breath. But Martha's lawyer stood unzipping a leather briefcase and pulling out a thick folder stacked with color-coded tabs. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "we have a financial declaration to submit on behalf of Ms. Martha James." Frank's smirk faltered, replaced by a puzzled frown as he watched his ex-wife sit with serene composure. The judge flipped through the folder. Page after page revealed detailed bank statements, official ownership certificates, brand partnership contracts, and valuation reports for Marielle & Co. The courtroom fell silent, the only sound being the crisp turn of paper under the judge's fingers. Finally, the judge looked up, adjusting his glasses. According to these documents, Ms. James is the sole owner and creative director of Marielle & Co., an online fashion brand valued at $18 million, with partnerships pending with 3 national retailers and projected expansions into Canada and the UK. Frank's face drained of color. His jaw hung slack as he stammered, "Wait, what, Marielle and Co.?" He blinked hard, as if the words themselves couldn't compute. That's you." His voice cracked thin with disbelief. Martha turned her head slowly, meeting his stunned gaze with calm, unblinking eyes. For the first time in years, she smiled at him, a small, graceful smile, untouched by bitterness or revenge. "It always was," she replied softly. "You just never asked." His lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably, trying to salvage his client's composure, but Frank's trembling hands betrayed him. Around them, courtroom staff exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift in power vibrating through the room like silent thunder. The woman he had dismissed as dead weight, the woman he mocked for years, sat before him now as a quietly triumphant business owner worth far more than he'd ever imagined. To Martha, this moment wasn't about rubbing her success in his face. It was about freedom. She didn't want his house with its cold, empty rooms. She didn't want his car that reeked of other women's perfume. She didn't even want his money. What she had built was hers alone, her empire of silk, cotton, and color crafted in the silent hours when he underestimated her most. As the judge called for a recess, Frank slumped into his chair, pale and shaken. But Martha simply gathered her documents and stood with quiet dignity, her shoulders square and steady. Because today was not the end of her story. Today was the first day of a life finally written in her own voice. As Martha stepped out of the courthouse into the brisk, late-morning air, a gentle breeze lifted her dark hair off her shoulders. The city around her moved, as it always did, honking cars, hurried pedestrians, the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from a street cart, but everything felt newly vivid. For the first time in over a decade, her lungs filled with a freedom so deep it almost felt unreal. She paused on the wide courthouse steps, her leather folder clutched to her chest, and closed her eyes, letting the cool wind brush against her face. "I am free," she whispered to herself, a quiet smile breaking across her lips. Behind her, Frank trudged down the marble steps, flanked by his lawyer, his designer shoes scuffing the stone with unsteady steps. Gone was his confident swagger. His tie hung loose around his neck, his complexion pale, as if he'd just stepped out of a sick room. A group of his business associates waiting at the curb averted their eyes awkwardly when they saw him shifting on their feet, as if unsure how to greet a man whose arrogance had been publicly shattered. Frank barely noticed them. His gaze remained fixed on Martha, his eyes haunted by disbelief, guilt, and something else, fear. She didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't about humiliating him or taking his empire away. Her empire had never been his to give or take. She had built it quietly, brick by brick, thread by thread, during nights he spent mocking women like her on his podcast. In his eyes, she was just a phase. In her own eyes, she had always been a force. A nearby reporter stationed to cover courthouse cases that day approached her hesitantly. "Mom, would you like to comment on what just happened in court today?" he asked, his voice trembling with curiosity and respect. Martha turned to him with a serene smile, her eyes bright and unwavering. "No comment today," she said softly. "Today is just the beginning." She walked away with steady steps, her heels clicking firmly against the pavement as the city swallowed her into its heartbeat. Inside her tote bag lay her phone vibrating with incoming orders, customer reviews, and partnership offers. But more importantly, inside her chest beat a heart that no longer sought validation from anyone else. Her success wasn't a tool to seek revenge. It was her proof that she was never dead weight. She was never invisible. She was, and always had been, enough. That evening, As twilight spilled gold and lavender across her small apartment's living room, Martha sat at her work desk, sketching a new scarf design inspired by wild prairie flowers. Her laptop pinged with a notification from an investor offering a significant partnership, but she didn't rush to open it. She let the moment sit in its quiet stillness. The scent of her jasmine candle mingled with the sound of the city settling into evening outside her window. For the first time, her dreams felt close enough to touch, not in the distant way they once seemed during sleepless nights, but close enough that she could feel their warmth in her chest. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment of silent prayer, not to ask for anything but to give thanks. Because tomorrow she would rise and keep building. Tomorrow she would continue weaving her purpose into every stitch, every fold, every seam of her brand. And tomorrow, just like today, she would walk through life, not as someone's shadow, but as her own light. Months later, as spring unfurled its first tender blossoms, Martha found herself standing in her new design studio, a sunlit space lined with crisp white shelves. Mannequin forms draped in her bold floral prints and potted lavender in each window. She walked slowly between her sketches pinned along corkboards, breathing in the scent of fresh cotton and blooming lilacs drifting through the open window. Orders streamed in steadily, not just from across the country, but from overseas boutiques requesting exclusive partnerships with Marielle and Conde. Yet what filled her with the deepest peace wasn't the rising numbers in her business account. It was knowing she had built it all with her own hands, in her own quiet, unbreakable way. Looking out at the city skyline, bathed in the soft blush of dawn, Martha whispered a truth to herself. Truth for everyone who has ever been underestimated. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silent decision to rise, to keep building, to keep believing in your worth when no one else does. Remember, your worth is never determined by another person's inability to see it. You are never just a phase. You are a force waiting to bloom. If Martha's journey touched your heart today, share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every story you leave. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that remind you no one can dim your light if you keep shining from within.